So welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at this concept check question, and then we'll look at the last few slides to talk about human interactions with plants. So how do we compare and contrast a pine cone and a flower? Well, in terms of comparison, remember that both pine cones and flowers are constructed of sporophylls. So that would be a common feature, the fact that they're both constructed of sporophylls. In a pine cone, there are two different types of cones. There is the staminate cone that produces pollen and the ovulate cone that produces the eggs. Those are typically found either on two different plants. So there is a male plant and a female plant, male plant having the staminate cones, the female plant having the ovulate cones. Or if they are located on the same plant, there are branches that are male branches and have the staminate cones, and female branches that have the ovulate cones. Let me just double check my notes. Yeah. In flowers, you have the stamens with the anthers where the pollen is produced. You have the ovary or the carpel with the ovary that contains the ovules where the eggs are produced. And in the case of many flowers, these are located within the same flower. Can they be in separate flowers? Yes. Can they be on separate plants? Yes. There can be male plants and female plants with male flowers and female flowers. There can be male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. But typically, we find both the male part, the stamens, and the female part, the carpel, contained within the same flower. So there you would have some similarities and some differences, compare and contrast between the pine cone and the flower. Okay, let's move on and take a look at how humans interact with flowers. So one of the things that we need to remember is that the vast majority of our food, in fact, almost all of our food that is plant-derived comes from seed plants, and particularly comes from flowering plants. So yes, we do get some food products from gymnosperms. So you might eat pine seeds, or you might use juniper or rosemary, which I've already indicated comes from conifers. But the vast majority of our food is derived from flowering plants. We also get our wood products from conifers. We've talked about that. 4 species of conifers provide all of the wood products, our building lumber, our paper products, and so forth. And as you're about to find out, many of our medicines are derived originally from plants until pharmaceutical companies figured out a way to make them synthetically. In some cases, we are still dependent on the plants for those medicines. So in terms of our food, and this comes as a real surprise to a lot of people, 6 crops, only 6 crops, account for 80% of the calories that humans worldwide consume. So wheat is not a surprise because bread is a staple in many places, and we have selectively bred wheat so that it can grow in just about every habitat and climate condition that you can imagine on pretty much every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And we've created wheat that can grow in summer, in winter, in spring. We've got wheat that can grow basically we can grow wheat all year round. And depending on how it's grown determines whether it's soft wheat or hard wheat, whether we would use it for bread, whether we would use it for pasta or other things. But there are so many products that are derived from wheat. If you're not using wheat as a basis for bread and things like that, then you'll use rice. Rice is the other large cereal grain. So between them, wheat and rice account for a significant portion of those calories. Corn then also becomes a staple, not so much a staple for humans, but as animal feedstock. But of course, we also eat corn as well. So it does form a significant part of the human diet. Then in terms of complex carbohydrates, starches and the like, potatoes are the primary crop that's used worldwide. If it's not potatoes, particularly in the Indo-Pacific basin, then it's cassava. Some of you may know it as maniota or manioc. It's the same plant. It produces tubers much like potatoes produce tubers, only this is only cassava is covered by a more rough coating. But again, it can be cooked like potato and eaten, or it can be roasted like potatoes, or it can be ground and starch can be washed out of it, much like potatoes. So you can wash starch out of potato. And if you're not using potatoes or cassava, then you'll consume sweet potatoes as a substitute. And that accounts for over 80% of all the calories that humans consume on a daily basis. Just those 6 crops. And much of what we can do with these crops, and much of the reason why we can get these high yields out of these crops, is because we have genetically modified these organisms through our artificial selection programs. And you notice the terminology that I used there. We have genetically modified these plants. Because one of the arguments that people have used against genetically modified plants as we know them in the modern terms is that these are artificial. Well, every plant that we rely on for food is artificially produced as a product of our artificial selection. Yes, we have genetically modified them through our artificial selection program, artificial breeding. So corn is derived from a little weed that grows in Central America called teosinte that looks absolutely nothing like corn. Modern wheat, we've talked about before, is a product of a three-way hybridization event. It's a hexaploid. Rice, as we know it in its modern form, is derived from a grass that grows in Southeast Asia. Potatoes, as you know them today, the russet potatoes and so forth, look nothing like the wild potatoes of the Andes. We have genetically modified them to produce food items that are superior to the wild type. The same is true with tomatoes, beans, squash, you name it, we have genetically modified them. Citrus, navel oranges that we all consume are the product of human intervention, a mutation that was accidentally discovered in the backyard of a home in Redlands, California. I've actually seen the original navel orange tree when I lived in California. And all navel oranges worldwide trace their origin back to that single tree. Human intervention. So what is the advantage of our modern ability to genetically modify plants? We can be surgically accurate in our modification. We can insert a single gene to carry out a particular task, and we can do so surgically, instead of relying on the hit and miss of selective breeding in the hope that we get what we want. And that selective breeding that we have done has produced plants that are totally dependent upon us and cannot survive if the climate changes too dramatically. And one of our concerns is this whole question of global warming. Our plants were genetically modified to take advantage of a cooler period that we recognize as something known as the Little Ice Age, a period of about 150 years that spans the mid to late 1700s and all of the 1800s, which is when much of our modern crops were developed. They like a cooler environment. And in fact, that little 150-year window was an aberration in the history of the Earth's climate. But it means that our crops will potentially not survive if the Earth's climate warms significantly. And that's going to put us in a whole world of hurt if, as the note suggests, 80% of our calories are derived from only 6 of those crops. Our ability to introduce individual genes from the wild type relatives of lots of our domesticated plants, and to do so in ways that allows us to introduce the possibility of survival in more extreme conditions, because the wild relatives have within them the genetic resources to do so, more so than our domesticated plants. That offers the opportunity to create crops that could survive global warming. But we have to be reasonable about it and accept the fact that, yes, we're already eating genetically modified crops. If you eat corn, if you use canola oil, if you use soybean products, those are all essentially genetically modified as we know them here in the United States. And many of our other agricultural crops and animal products are the product of genetically modified organisms. Just want to point that out, seeing as how we're talking about our reliance on other organisms for food. We also know that many of the protective chemicals that plants produce can be used for human intervention. So daisies produce substances called pyrethrins. They're a natural insecticide. We have developed the ability to extract those pyrethrins to use as insecticides, but we've also now figured out how to make them synthetically. So if you spray insecticides around, you're probably using an insecticide that contains pyrethrins. Check the side of your spray can. And those were originally derived from daisies as a way of protecting themselves from herbivory. Other secondary compounds that plants produce for various and sundry reasons can be used as medicines. So here is a list of some medicines that have an origin in plant material. The original industrial pharmaceutical, aspirin. So aspirin derived salicylic acid. So salicylic acid was the original painkiller. If you went to a herbal healer before there was modern pharmaceutical and complained of a toothache, they would give you a piece of fresh willow bark to chew on, and you would get pain relief from the salicylic acid. The salicylic acid is produced by most plants. It just so happens that the bark of the willow tree has a higher than normal percentage of it. What does salicylic acid do for plants? It's used as a signal, specifically to signal that the plant is under attack by insects or pathogens in general. So the damaged tissue releases salicylic acid that diffuses cell to cell, also enters the phloem and gets transported to other locations in the plant and signals to the plant that it is under attack. What is interesting is, as we'll learn next week, the interactions between plants and fungi form a network that allows for plants to signal each other that they're under attack via the connections established by the fungi. we'll talk about that next week when we do fungi. But the downside of salicylic acid is that it triggers stomach bleeding because it's an irritant to the stomach lining. So salicylic acid was originally extracted by the Bayer Chemical Company, and they had the patent on salicylic acid, but they also recognized that salicylic acid was probably not the best way to distribute pain relief. So they came up with a way of modifying the salicylic acid so it was less of a stomach irritant, and that's what we call today aspirin. Aspirin belongs to a class of drugs called NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And that also includes things like Aleve, and I can't remember whether it's Tylenol or, well, I do know that it's not Tylenol, it's, now I'm having a blank again. I'll probably remember it just after I close down the recording. Anyway, it's the other pain, Advil, that's it. So Advil, aspirin, and Aleve are all modifications of the basic salicylic acid form. The modifications are to reduce their irritation of the stomach lining so you don't get as much stomach bleeding. But they are all pain relievers and they act as non-steroidal anti-inflammatories because of the effect of salicylic acid or aspirin. But something the book doesn't actually get into, but something that I wanted to talk about. Ethnobotany. Is the study of plants as medicinals by traditional cultures. And those of you who are considering going to medical school, if you are looking for a way of adding a plant-based upper division elective into your degree, which most biology departments expect you to do, I know they do over at UCF from my own experience over there as a faculty member in the biology department. The class that is recommended is their ethnobotany class. And it fills very, very quickly every semester because people who want to go to medical school know that they need, this is probably the only plant class that is appropriate for a degree that's geared towards entry into medical school. So if you are planning that sort of a career move and you are going to one of our Florida four-year schools, look for the ethnobotany class because that's the class you need to get into as quickly as you can as a junior or a senior, because you're going to be in competition with everybody else who wants to go to medical school. A little bit of career advice. Then we cannot negate the role of plants globally. We know historically, and we can see this, I'll show you a graph. We can see the effect of plants on the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over time. And you can see that at one point there were significant levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but as soon as we encounter that period of time when plants begin colonization of dry land, we see that the relative amounts of carbon dioxide starts to decrease very rapidly as plants start to dominate the landscape. We do see an increase in carbon dioxide here at the end of the Paleozoic. This is actually the end Permian. We know that there was significant volcanic activity at the end of the end Permian, which triggered what is known as the end Permian mass extinction, the single largest mass extinction on record, when some 96% of all species went extinct. And hence we see the increase in carbon dioxide. And it took a significant amount of time for the levels of carbon dioxide to decrease again. So throughout the Mesozoic, we see a slow but steady decrease in the levels of carbon dioxide that continued on until about 200, 250 years from present, when we see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the widespread use of fossil fuels as a source of energy. And every time you burn fossil fuel, you add carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And what you are returning is carbon dioxide that was once part of the atmosphere but was sequestered away thanks to the activity of plants and locked away as fossilized material, only to be released when we started burning those fossilized fuels again. And that accounts for this uptick that we're seeing right now in the levels of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, a process that is ongoing. So one of the other issues that we need to confront is the fact that as we deforest, as we continue to remove plant material, ecosystems and challenge ecosystems, not only are we losing plant species, but we're losing animal species, but we're also losing possible resources for ourselves, because remember, lots of our drugs and other pharmaceuticals had their origins in plants originally. We've only investigated about 5,000 species of plants as potential sources of pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, at the rate that we are deforesting rainforests and other regions, we will likely lose lots of plants before we can even investigate whether they contain potential pharmaceuticals or other beneficial materials. These are a resource, but they are non-renewable, because once the species disappears, it's gone for good and we'll never recover it again. Something to think deeply about as we think about our own practices and our own habits. That is, in fact, the subject of my last concept check question. Why is plant diversity considered to be a non-renewable resource? They're a resource because we get food, we get pharmaceuticals, they affect our climate, they provide us with the oxygen we breathe, or a percentage of the oxygen we breathe. They maintain habitats. They're all potential values that we can get from plants. If we destroy that, if we lose our habitats, if we lose our ecosystems, if we don't take advantage of what plants have to offer us, and we don't take advantage of those resources while the plants are still present, once they're gone for good. They're permanently lost. And that's the reason why, as far as our agriculturally significant plants and their wild relatives, we are trying to maintain a repository of germplasm tissue, meaning seeds and other tissue that we can use to recover the plants if we should ever lose them to some ecological disaster or some environmental disaster. That is being built in an old mine that is located on an island inside the Arctic Circle, where it's cold, and will help preserve the tissue. But the irony here is that it's now been noticed that the permafrost that is protecting this very, very important biological resource is starting to show signs of the effect of global warming. because we know that the Arctic and the Antarctic are warming, and they are both actually warming at a faster rate than other areas. And it may very well be that our attempt to preserve some of our biodiversity against the disaster, an environmental disaster, may actually be lost to the very environmental disaster that we're trying to protect them against. Food for thought. Pun very much intended. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the plant kingdom. Next, we will be looking at fungi, and it is very apropos that we think about fungi immediately following plants, because we know that fungi and plants co-colonized dry land about 470 million years ago, somewhere around that time. And to this day, fungi and plants still interact very intimately, and that leads to a lot of interesting observations about the role of fungi in the environment. But more to come next time. So until then, be safe, and if you have any concerns, questions, or comments about anything that I've recorded here in this chapter or the previous chapter about plants, be sure to come and see me in office hours or send me an email, and let's talk about your concerns. See you next time.